Here we back. Yeah, we back. Now, today, I'm going to be releasing a pay-per-view to the public, right? So, now keep in mind, this is not something that I do very often. I feel like pay-per-view videos should be for the true supporters, the true loyalists. But on the rare occasion, I might let it go to the public sometimes, right? Sometimes, but not all the time. Right, so today I'm going to be releasing this one to the public. I dropped it in the last week or so, and it was entitled, The World Without African Colonization. And that video was pretty much me reflecting on how history would have played out if Europeans never made incursions into Africa, right? And I also felt it was a good follow-up to the recent series that I dropped entitled, The Biography of King Henry Christophe, one of the greatest black men to ever walk the face of the earth. And if you watch that series, then you remember what I said towards the end. I said, when Christophe died, right, when Christophe died and his regime fell, that was one of the worst things to ever happen to black men, the black race as a whole, right? That was the worst thing to ever happen. One of the worst things to ever happen in recent history. And in that video, I pretty much just thought of this alternate scenario. How would have history played out? And that video was also inspired by a passage from a book that actually came out 100 years ago in another biography of Christophe's life, but the book that I read was actually a recent biography that came out last year. But in this old biography that came out in the 1920s, take a look up on the screen, it said this. Over 100 years ago, a great king made the town of Cap-Haïtien his capital. He was a black man who was born a slave. But under him, the city of the Cap and the country roundabout presented a different picture. There was a theater in the Cap, and there were schools. No one was indolent or dirty, for indolence and filth were forbidden by the king. Factories were busy, and the bay was filled with ships. The great plain between the hills was a sugar field, the finest in the entire world. Its area measured by hundreds of square miles. Along the roads out of the town, roads bedded evenly with gleaming white stones, were plantations owned by Negroes who bore with dignity the titles of Duke and Baron and Count. The northern half of Haiti was a kingdom that during its brief span of life ranked in the opinion of Europe with the most forceful of the New World powers. There were two men of transcendent greatness, Napoleon of France and the King of Haiti, Christophe, the only man alive who had defeated him in war. Now, obviously after Christophe died, decades after Christophe died, the Europeans began making incursions into Africa, which set the world on the trajectory that we see today. But in this video, I pretty much thought about, man, what if it went a different way, right? What if Europeans didn't make incursions into Africa? And how would it have played out? So in this video, I present this alternate timeline of how things could have been, right? How beautiful things could have been. But also, like I said, if you haven't checked out my series on Christophe's life, the biography of Christophe, go to my playlist section, check it out. If you're a black man and you haven't checked it out, shame on you. Anyways, I'm gonna run the pay-per-view and we out. Yeah, we back. Yeah, we back. Now today is gonna be an interesting video. Now the inspiration for this video came because I was sitting back reflecting on the lost human capital to the transatlantic slave trade. I know that's something strange to be thinking about, but I was thinking about, like, for example, in the Portuguese colonies, you had slavery lasted over 300 years, Spanish colonies, 300 years, French colonies, almost 300 years, British colonies, whatever, right? Then I thought about the amount of black men, women, and children that were transported to the colonies, right? They say between 10 million, 12 million, something like that, right? Then I thought about the amount of people that were born into bondage and then died in bondage. Or maybe they might have died as children or teenagers. They might have died early through malnutrition, illness, abuse, whatever it may be. Then I thought about the amount of human capital that we lost, the amount of doctors and scientists and engineers and philosophers and intellectuals and artists and leaders and nation builders and great minds and great talents that unfortunately were never allowed to blossom, right? Imagine Nefertari Dessalines. I was never allowed, my talent and my gifts were never allowed to flourish. And my only contributions to the planet was reduced to a cotton plantation or a tobacco plantation or a sugar plantation or a coffee plantation, right? And I was never allowed to really harness my gifts. And that was the fate for millions of our ancestors, millions and millions and millions. When you tally up the amount that were transported through the Middle Passage, the amount that were born and died in bondage, the amount of human capital that we lost in terms of our collective development is tragic. It's massive. Then I began to think about, what if the African continent was never colonized, right? What if maybe after, the Europeans abolished the slave trade, what if they just, went back to wherever they came from, or they never made any incursions into Africa after the fact? Because after they so-called abolished the slave trade, that's when they began to make incursions into the continent, right? And then I thought about, okay, the United States, the most powerful nation in the world right now, got its independence around the same time that Haiti got its independence. Then I thought about, okay, how would that have altered history? How would that have altered the trajectory of the United States? And even how would that have altered the trajectory of Haiti if Africa was not attacked after the abolition of the slave trade, after Africa was not targeted for colonization? How would that have changed the geopolitical landscape of today? So that's what I want to talk about, right? I want to talk about how the world would have looked like if the Europeans did not make any incursions into Africa, or if they were stopped from making any incursions into Africa. How would the world look like in the modern day for black men? And I think it would look very different. So today's going to be an interesting type of video. I'm going to be examining how things could have played out a little differently. And I'm also going to be talking about how Pan-Africanism, especially if it was incorporated during this time, how that would have completely changed the trajectory of modern history. Now, in this video, I'm going to be examining and comparing and contrasting the trajectory of the United States and the trajectory of Haiti, right? Both nations got their independence around the same exact time. I would say the United States around, 1776, and Haiti about 30 years after the fact. So, as you already know, United States went on to become a major power on the international stage, and Haiti, for a variety of reasons, has struggled to solidify itself on the international stage. And today we're going to discuss that. How would the world look like? Because I'm of the opinion that a world without African colonization, there would be no United States, the most powerful nation in the world. There wouldn't be none in that. In fact, a world without African colonization, you could even say that the United States would be relegated to a regional power, and Haiti would be in the running to be a world power, if you want to be honest, along with many other African nations side by side. Now, why do I say that? When you examine the early history of the United States, the early foundation that was laid for it to later become a global superpower, it was heavily influenced by the trade relations and the partnerships and the alliances that it had with the prominent European powers during the 1800s and the 1900s. The access that it had to these markets, the exchange of goods and raw materials and technology. This was the early foundation for the economic growth of the United States. Now, when you examine Haiti, for example, Haiti did not have the same exact opportunities to do trade and exchange technologies and resources with their African brothers, with their African cousins. And this was for a variety of reasons. In order to do business, you need an environment of stability. Now, during this time, the Europeans were arming various different African nations against each other, weaponizing different rivalries and beefs, and providing weapons to this nation, providing arms to this nation, encouraging them to beef and war with each other for their own economic interests. So the African continent was unstable and it was under attack. And the Europeans during this time were beginning to make incursions into the continent. And not only were the Europeans beginning to make incursions into the continent, but also Haiti, as a newly established nation, was focused on its own internal security, because the Europeans were also attempting to make incursions back into Haiti also. So Haiti never had the time to sit back and take a breath and begin to focus on its economic development, because it was mainly focused on its national security in the early days, especially under Christophe's regime, when you could say that Haiti reached its height of success. If you go to my playlist section, I read a biography of King Henry Christophe. I read the life of King Henry Christophe. Go check it out, man. Go to my playlist section. Now, unfortunately, Christophe died in the year 1820. And like I said in that series, that was one of the worst things to ever happen, not only to the nation, but to the black race as a whole. And now in today's video, we're going to examine how would things have played out differently? How would the trajectory of history played out if, in the same way that the United States was able to establish trade relations with the continent of Europe, how would the world have played out if Haiti was able to establish trade relations with the continent of Africa? Now, let's set the scene, right? So it's the early 1800s, let's say the early 1810s, right? The United States is involved in westward expansion. You know, they got the Louisiana Territory. Obviously, slavery is still entrenched. Agriculture is still a centerpiece of the economy. Now, when you examine Haiti at the time, right, newly independent, Christophe is in power in the north, the Kingdom of Haiti. He's building the Citadel, the largest military fortress in the entire Western Hemisphere, heavily militarized nation based on large-scale agriculture. Also, keep in mind that Haiti was the largest producer of coffee and sugar at the time, right? So a major player in terms of the economic trade markets, just by the amount of coffee and sugar that was being produced on the island. And Christophe, like I said, the entire economy was based on large-scale state-run agriculture. So the coffee and sugar production was still at a high level. And if you listen to my series, The Biography of King Henry Christophe, then you know that, yes, even though Haiti was on paper under embargo and did not receive diplomatic recognition of their independence, due to the fact that they were the largest producer of coffee and sugar, there was still a lot of under-the-table trade going down, right? People were still coming to buy their coffee and their sugar under the table, off the book, so to speak. And it was from that revenue that Christophe was able to build the palace and build the citadel and establish the schools and the medical system and things like that. Because even though there was no official trade on paper, right, it was a lot of undercover clandestine trade going down as well. Because at the end of the day, the people wanted their coffee and their sugar. Now, I don't know why during that time in the early 1800s, sugar was one of the most valuable and widely traded commodities in the world. So, you know, it was a very, very, very important resource. And Haiti had a major influence over those markets, especially after the Haitian Revolution. When France lost 2/3 of its global trade revenue, Haiti stepped in and inherited those markets. Now, unfortunately, because Haiti was so preoccupied with its own internal security and the Europeans were trying to establish greater control over Africa after the abolition of the slave trade, Haiti was never able to penetrate the African markets. They were doing business with the British and they were doing business with the other neighboring islands like St. Thomas and, you know, even some undercover American merchants and things like that. But they were never able to penetrate the African markets. And in this video, I'm going to examine how history would have completely been different if Haiti would have been able to penetrate the African markets and also begin to have real trade relations, bilateral cooperation with African states during that time, how both of us could have grown to become mega powers on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, like I mentioned before, the export of raw materials in the early days like cotton and tobacco, this was crucial. This was the foundation for generating capital for the United States economy. These trade relations provided the resources to invest in the early American infrastructure, the early Industrial Revolution, things like that, right? Now, African colonies, as we already know, they were rich in the minerals like the gold and the diamonds and the copper and the palm oil and things like that, which were extracted by the European powers. And the United States, by extension, they benefited by importing these raw materials directly from European nations, right? Through their trade networks with the European nations, they were able to access these raw materials from Africa, even though they themselves never had any official African colonies. So you can see how from the beginning, Haiti was on the back foot, because the Americans were able to access the African markets before Haiti was able to access the African markets. And Haiti is a nation of African descended people, but the Americans were able to access the African markets before us, which was able to jumpstart their economy even further, right? Off the back, they already had chattel slavery, you know, free labor, but now they had access to the raw materials on the African continent before we did. Also, keep in mind, the United States, they exported manufactured goods to the African colonies, the European colonies in Africa. Machinery, textiles, industrial products, etc., etc. The American companies saw Africa as an expanding market. So not only did they have access to the raw materials, they also had access to the African markets to export the finished products back to sell on the African continent. And this was done due to the fact that they had relations with the colonial governments. Right? Obviously, the colonial governments, the European powers, we're not going to give Haiti access to those markets. They were going to give preferential treatment to their European brothers in North America. And not only did this limit the growth of African nations on the continent, because instead of developing, they had to combat colonialism and things like that. This also hampered our growth on the other side of the Atlantic because Haiti did not have access to those markets. So that's why today we're going to examine how history would have been different if not only we had access to those markets, but Africa itself was also allowed to grow and flourish, just like Europe was allowed to grow and flourish. Now, let's imagine it's the early 1800s. The slave trade has just been abolished. Christophe is in power. He's the king of Haiti. Now, if you watch my series, then you already know Christophe had a very militarized nation, right? He had the Navy, he had the infantry, he had the cavalry, the whole military. He had the latest military technology. He had the citadel equipped with hundreds of cannons. Christophe was ready for war. Christophe was ready for war. And Christophe at that time was getting a whole lot of money. And he probably would have been getting a whole lot of more money if he was able to connect with Africa and able to solidify relations with Africa during his time in power. Now, like I mentioned before, Christophe at this time, his nation was a leading producer of sugar and coffee under a system of state-controlled agriculture. Now, with access to the African raw materials through fair trade agreements, Haiti would have been able to develop its own industries further by processing raw materials, not only for export, but also for domestic consumption as well, because we had a growing population as well. We had a lot of young children. So the population would have been able to grow. So it would have served as a market not only for us to sell our coffee, our sugar, but also for the African nations to also sell products back to us in a mutually beneficial scenario. Now, for those of y'all that watch my series on Christophe's life, then you know that Christophe had a very powerful navy, right? He didn't have just 1 or 2 warships. He had a fleet of at least 10 warships. 10 warships. And we also discussed how he was able to assemble a fleet of that caliber, especially when his nation was under quote unquote embargo. But like I said, go check out that series, man. Epic story, man. Epic book, man. Epic biography, right? So Christophe had a very formidable navy. Now, when you combine Haiti's naval power at the time, which was exemplified by when they went around capturing European slave vessels and rescuing the enslaved Africans that were shackled on the ships. If you combine the naval power with the production of large-scale state-controlled agriculture, this would have been a good exchange of expertise and resources between Haiti and the continent. Because the Europeans weren't coming to the table with anything valuable, to be honest. They were just coming to the table with, cheap, janky products. They weren't coming with any knowledge or expertise or any valuable goods. They were coming with bullshit. So that would have given us leverage in negotiations, because while the European was offering bullshit, we would have been offering true, tangible things that can really strengthen the power and influence of our brothers on the continent. And on top of that, we would have been coming in peace. Unlike the European, who was coming with duplicitous intentions, we would have been coming with non-hostile intentions. So to me, it would have been a no-brainer. I think the majority of African states would have chosen to do business with us rather than the Dutch or the French or the Spanish or the British or whoever other European colonial power would have been coming with their bullshit trinkets. And even beyond trade, I also think history would have been different, because at that time, under Christophe's regime, there was state-run printing presses that were publishing and distributing literature across the Atlantic world. So this would have been crucial for us as black men being able to control our own narratives instead of allowing the narratives to be shaped by the European writers of the time. If we had direct relations with our brothers on the continent, imagine the literature that could have been released, right? That's something I think about too. Now, besides trade and cultural exchange, I think about the military power, the military strength that could have been realized if, like I said, Haiti had access to the African markets the same way that the United States had access to the European markets, because the United States, through their partnerships with Europe, they were able to create things like NATO, right? The military alliance in Western Europe with the United States and all the Western powers. Imagine that we had somewhat of our own type of NATO, our own type of military alliance, right? It would have changed the course of history. Imagine a world where Haiti under Christophe, equipped with a strong navy and formidable military, could have formed a military alliance with African nations instead of going to forming alliances with nations like Great Britain and things like that, because during that time, Great Britain was at war with France. So Christophe was trying to establish an anti-French coalition with nations like Great Britain and Russia. But instead of trying to go to those nations, imagine Christophe having access to the African markets and going straight to the brothers on the continent and establishing military relations with them. Then we would have been able to project power and influence on both sides of the Atlantic. And from there, we would have been able to collectively fight against European aggression with a united front that would make it difficult for the European powers to not only impose sanctions and blockades and military interventions, but this would allow us to protect our trade routes across the Atlantic. Now you see why I'm such a proponent of unity and Pan-Africanism and working together, because imagine a world where this actually took place. This would have changed the course of history. Imagine a world where black men stuck together. Black men would be on top right now. Now, let's continue. Imagine a world where instead of African goods being shipped out to Europe or to the United States, imagine where it would be shipped out to Haiti or other black nations across the Atlantic, where now international trade would be firmly under our control. Imagine a world where black men controlled the trade of coffee and sugar and gold and ivory and spices and palm oil and diamonds and rubber and copper and timber, etc., etc. It wouldn't even matter if these other European nations had Haiti under embargo, because black men would be the one controlling the markets. Black men would be the one controlling the trade routes. The world would look like a very different place. Imagine a world where the European powers were not able to capitalize or enrich themselves through the colonization of Africa. The trajectory of even the United States would have been completely different. The economies of the European powers would be extremely weak or damn near non-existent. So when you examine the Industrial Revolution, how would Great Britain or France or the United States be able to support or maintain their so-called industrial revolutions without the vast wealth extracted from Africa? It wouldn't be able to happen. It wouldn't be able to happen. And because of that, the United States wouldn't have been able to lay the groundwork and the foundations for them to go on to become a superpower on the international stage, right? They would probably be relegated to a regional power at best, because when you examine their infrastructure, the machinery, the military technology, all that came from having access, not only access, but cheap access to the African markets, courtesy of the colonial governments. And even when you fast forward to the 20th century, once you remove the wealth extracted from Africa, how would they have been able to project their military power? They would not even be a NATO. NATO probably wouldn't even exist in a modern day. Meanwhile, in this alternate scenario, if Haiti had access to a free and independent Africa that wasn't under attack by colonization, it would have been able to thrive economically by trading its agricultural products and military equipment in exchange for African resources, right? The exchange of goods and technology would have skyrocketed Haiti's industrial capacity, and also serving as a market for finished manufactured products coming directly from Africa. Because I truly believe that if we were left alone, if we didn't have to constantly look over our shoulder and have to fight off these different adversaries coming to attack us, I truly believe that Africa would have amassed the wealth to industrialize and also been able to really become a true power on the economic markets. And the same way that America was able to build itself with its partnerships with Europe, I believe that Haiti would have been able to build itself with its partnerships with Africa, and it would have been mutually beneficial. We would have both been able to rise in power together. And when you think about it, with Europe in this weakened state and Haiti in this strengthened position, the Caribbean and Latin American nations would have looked to Haiti for leadership, and by extension, Africa, instead of the United States and Europe. And instead of the international geopolitical landscape being dominated by the so-called the Western powers, it would have had to battle for dominance with the African powers, right? With the Pan-African powers, with the African Atlantic Coalition, whatever they want to call us, whatever name we would be called, right? It wouldn't be dominated by the Western powers. They would have competition. It would be a multipolar world. Now, going back to the military power at the time, like I said, when Christophe was in power, Haiti was a very well-respected, militarized nation state. And even though Christophe was under embargo, he was able to smuggle weapons and even warships into Haiti through a variety of ways, right? Because just as Christophe obtained warships for his navy, which he deployed to rescue enslaved Africans, he also relied on a network of foreign merchants who were willing to engage in undercover trade with Haiti. And these merchants often sold weapons like muskets, artillery, ammunition under the table, right? And they smuggled arms into Haiti, often using complex routes that involve multiple stops in different locations to obscure the final destination. Weapons were often purchased or smuggled through neutral locations in the Caribbean or Southern America, where officials turned a blind eye to the end destination of these weapons, probably because they were bribed or it served their own interests. Christophe also authorized privateers, which was basically state-sanctioned pirates, to capture enemy vessels, particularly those of France and her allies. And these captured vessels were targeted because they were known to carry arms and ammunition, which were then stolen for the Haitian military. And these trade networks could have boosted the military capacity of African nations, with Haiti serving as a source for military material, instead of African kings relying on European merchants who provided janky deals and outdated weapons. Christophe was also known to smuggle weapons hidden among other cargo, like agricultural products or household goods, to disguise their true nature. And ships carrying these disguised shipments would sail under false flags or carry fake manifests to avoid detection by hostile European navies. So not only would this bilateral cooperation would have been beneficial for both Haiti and the African nations, but also, like I said, instead of African nations relying directly on the French or the British or the Dutch or the Portuguese for military technology, they could have got it directly straight from us, because we already had a network of different trade routes to smuggle in weapons to strengthen our military and our military capacity. And by extension, Haiti serving as a middleman to ship weapons over to African nations, this would have boosted the military capacity of African nations to be able to defend themselves against the incoming Berlin Conference that would have taken place, decades into the future, right? So, like I said, everybody can hate on Pan-Africanism all they want, but at the end of the day, Pan-Africanism would have saved Haiti. Pan-Africanism would have saved us. I'm telling you, because without Pan-Africanism, without us having access to the African markets, without us being able to do trade and do commerce and exchange ideas and resources with our brothers on the African continent, we were pigeonholed and forced to do business in the Western markets. And we were locked out of the Western markets. And we couldn't access the African markets because the same people that controlled the Western markets were colonizing the African markets. So in this scenario where Africa was untouched and was not under attack by colonialism, like imagine if after the abolition of the slave trade, the Europeans just packed up their shit and left, and we were able to, gather ourselves and get back to it and regroup. I think that, like I said, the trajectory of the world would have been so different, man. The trajectory of the world would have been so different. Would have been so different, bro. So much so that even if the Berlin Conference happened later on in the century, I think that Africa would have been in a way better position to defend themselves at that point, right? That's what I think. Now, we did have intellectuals and scholars who did try to establish this connection later on, but I believe at that time it was too late. But we had guys like Antonin Furman. Take a look up on the screen. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Agriculture in the late 1800s. Shout out to Antonin Furman. Antonin Furman is one of 3 Caribbean men who launched the idea of Pan-Africanism at the end of the 19th century to combat colonialism in Africa. As a candidate in Haiti's 1902 presidential elections, he declared that the Haitian state should serve in the rehabilitation of Africa, along with the Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams and fellow Haitian Benito Sylvain. He was the organizer of the first Pan-African Conference, which took place in London in 1900. That conference launched the Pan-Africanism movement. W.E.B. Du Bois attended the conference and was put in charge of drafting the general report. After the conference, 5 Pan-African Congresses were held in the 20th century, which eventually led to the creation of the African Union. Now, yes indeed, when Antonin Furman ran for president in the early 1900s, his platform was based on establishing this connection with Africa that I mentioned before, because during this time the scramble for Africa was going down. So he believed that the Haitian state should serve in the rehabilitation of Africa, right? Because he understood that our fates were connected, right? And he knew that if Africa is under attack, it's going to make it more difficult for us to rise. So he knew that if Africa was liberated, then that would open the door for us to have greater opportunities in the future. Now, unfortunately, he was sabotaged by the Western powers. The United States and the German government and various European powers came together to sabotage his presidential campaign and to back the opposition. But Antonin Furman, like I said, man, definitely planted the seed, before the days of Marcus Garvey. I believe Marcus Garvey came a couple decades after him, but Antonin Furman, definitely one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, wrote one of the greatest books in defense of the black race entitled The Equality of the Human Races. Shout out to Antonin Furman, man. Shout out to Antonin Furman. But yeah, man. Yeah, so I was just sitting back, relaxing this morning. It just came to mind. This topic came to mind, and I wanted to discuss it, man. I think the trajectory of the world could have been much different if black men were able to have the time and space to do business and engage in commerce and free trade amongst each other. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way because Haiti was under attack from the very beginning. And even though Christophe was able to establish many great things after he died, everything fell apart after he died. And then Africa was already under attack and was very unstable due to the incursions and the constant flooding of weapons by the European powers that were trying to destabilize the continent for their own benefit. And then shortly after that, the Berlin Conference came later on in the century. And then the United States invaded and occupied Haiti for 20 years. And then, like I said, Haiti was pretty much in isolation for the majority of its existence. But anyways, man, it's your boy Never Card Salim back in the Billy, yes indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the platform, man. Support the platform. Peace.